This conference will now be recorded.
Great. So welcome everyone to another OCP TAP session. We have today Dr. Judah Levine. So a little bit as like the format, introducing our speaker. Judah Levine joined the staff of National Bureau of Standards, NBS, in 1969. The NBS was renamed to NIST later in 1980. And Dr. Levine has worked in time and frequency division of NBS and NIST since 1972. So currently, Dr. Levine is a fellow of the National Institute of NIST, and is the leader of the network synchronization project in time and frequency division. He's also a fellow of the GILA, an institute on the campus of University of Colorado that is operated jointly by the University of Colorado and NIST, and he is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Physics of the university. Also, Dr. Levine is responsible for design and implementation of timescale 81 and UTC of NIST, which provides the reference signals for all of NIST time and frequency services. He's also he also designed and implemented 3 backup time scales in Boulder, the TSC, KGA, and KGC, which improve the reliability and availability of the time services. In addition to primary timescale in Boulder, satellite timescale at NIST and Gaithersburg facility, and at NIST radio station, the WWV in Fort Collins, Colorado, provides a reference time for time services at those locations. Also, Dr. Levine steers these timescales from time to time by adjustments to ensemble frequencies, so as maintain a close agreement between such of these timescales and UTC timescale computed by the International Bureau of Weights and Measurement, BIMP. So last but not least, again, Dr. Levine designed and built the servers that support the automated computer time services, ACTS, and the Internet Time Service, which provide time and frequency information to users in a number of different digital formats. He also developed silent software for a number of common operating systems, so like the clients, like I'm assuming again, like whatever synchronizes your clock via the internet. So I mean, assuming mostly they're in NTP world. Today's talk will be about NIST's digital time services. So with no further ado, Judah, the floor is yours.
Very good, thank you. Everybody can hear me. It's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And on this slide, I have given my email address. So if there are any questions after the talk, which are not answered now or whenever, then you are welcome to send me email messages, and I will try to address whatever questions you have. Now, I'd like to begin with a short introduction to time and frequency so that we all understand the basics. First of all, the definition of the base unit of time is a hyperfine transition in the ground state of cesium defines a standard frequency. And I show you that standard frequency. It's 9 gigahertz. For those of you who are not familiar with frequencies, it's somewhat higher than the frequency that's used in microwave ovens, but it's that kind of frequency microwave. So an atomic clock simply takes an electronic oscillator and locks the frequency of that oscillator to the transition in cesium, and so that the oscillation frequency of this electrical oscillator reproduces the cesium frequency. Then once you have that electronic oscillator, you count those cycles and when you count the requisite number of cycles, you get a cesium second. You count 9, 192, 61, 770 cycles, and that's 1 cesium second. There are methods, electronic methods, which are used for deriving other frequencies. There are a whole bunch of other standard frequencies, and there are various electronic techniques of multiplication and division that are used for constructing these other frequencies. Now, there are also clocks, atomic clocks based on rubidium and hydrogen, and those frequencies are the principle is the same. They use an electronic oscillator locked to a frequency, and the frequencies of those other transitions are known well enough that these secondary representations, as they're called, are equivalent to the cesium frequency for almost every purpose, both in terms of accuracy and stability and so on. Now, there are a number of different applications that the atomic clocks are used for, and I'd like to briefly discuss two of them before I focus on time, which is really what we're talking about today. The first application is application of frequency, in which what you're interested is, for example, the generation and transmission of electrical power, where you're interested in a frequency like 60 hertz or 50 hertz, and there is no explicit link to a time reference, it's just frequency. Communication links depend on frequency. The frequency of radio broadcasts are determined based on those standards. In fact, establishing the frequencies, the standard frequencies of radio broadcasts was the first real use that NBS frequency standards were used for back in the 1920s. The frequency standard is also the basis for other standards such as the volt. There's an effect called the Josephson effect, which links the definition of the volt to the definition of frequency. The frequency is also important in physics and astronomy. The Doppler shift, which is the frequency, the apparent shift in the frequency when an object is moving, is used for speed. The spectroscopy and atomic properties, and there are tests of relativity, which is determining frequency of a clock as it's affected by accelerations or velocities or change in gravitational potential and so on. Now, there are also applications which don't depend on frequency, but which do depend on time interval, namely not specifically on time, on when the measurement is made, but on some elapsed time. And they are usually implemented by a count of the cycles of the standard frequency or by some other frequency that's derived from the standard frequency. The unit is obviously the second. And so, for example, the most well-known application for that kind of thing is radar, in which you determine the distance to an object by the transit time interval. All navigation systems, GPS, satellite systems, all of them depend on measurements of time interval, in which you measure the transit time of a signal from a satellite to a receiver, and you determine, because you know the transit time, you determine the distance, and if you observe multiple satellites, you determine the position. The time interval is also used for speed or hardware processes and so on and so on. I'm not going to dwell on any of these subjects. I just want to emphasize the fact that the frequency standard that we develop and operate has many diverse applications which are derived from the same frequency, but which have very different goals and very different techniques often. The frequency, the time interval is also linked to the definition of the meter, which is defined in terms of the distance that light travels in such a time. Now let me come to time. The standard for time is Coordinated Universal Time, which is abbreviated UTC. And UTC is a strange acronym because it doesn't consist with the word, it isn't consistent with the word order in English or in French. It's just a historical thing. UTC is basically derived from the cesium second. You simply count cesium seconds relative to some origin, and then when you count those seconds, you build minutes and hours and days and so on and so on. The origin time of the atomic clocks of the UTC was set based on astronomy. Namely, in 1972, you adjusted atomic time to match astronomical time at that instant, and then periodically you adjust UTC to maintain a link with the rotation angle of the Earth, which of course is the historical definition of time. the position of the Earth with respect to the sun or the moon or the stars has been used as an indicator of time, of course, since antiquity. Now, since 1972, the adjustments, that is, those adjustments to keep astronomical time and atomic time in sync, have been done by what are called leap seconds, in which a second is added or dropped to UTC on an irregular basis as whenever it's needed. And there have been 37 leap seconds, all of which have been added since 1972. There has currently been a long-standing discussion about changing the definition, that is, changing the method of doing this, and it's been motivated primarily by the difficulties of the leap second method. The problem is that in 1972, the balance between astronomical time applications that depend on a link to astronomy and other applications that depend on a smooth and continuous timescale was changed. The astronomical applications were much more important in 1972, and they're much less important now. So a smooth and continuous timescale is a much more important criterion at the moment, which suggests some kind of modification to the leap second system. Now, this has been discussed for some time. It's hard to say yet exactly what change will be made. It's still under discussion, but whatever change is made, the link to astronomical time, which of course is the traditional measure of time, the everyday understanding of time, is going to be preserved. Now, needless to say, and contrary to what a lot of people think, satisfying all these requirements is no simple solution. If there were a simple solution, it would have been done long ago. And satisfying the different constituencies is a big deal. And all I can say is that discussions are ongoing. Now, I'd like to stop for a moment and deliver a sermon because I'm very concerned about this particular issue, and that is that I'd like to remind all of you that UTC is the basis for legal time in most countries, so that the time zones and daylight saving time and so on are all derived from UTC based on some offset which is legally defined. International time and standards are very important. That is, standards of everything are very important, but international time is particularly important. It simplifies, it facilitates coordination, collaboration, and commerce. You can use a cell phone to call from the United States to Europe or from Europe to anywhere else without having to be concerned about how the carrier actually handles the calls, because it's transparent to you, and that is an extremely important advantage. A private non-conforming timescale compromises the fundamental advantages of the international standard. It's a thing in which undoes the attempt that has been made to make standards invisible so that nobody has to worry about what the standard is or how it's defined or whatever. It's particularly difficult when a private non-conforming timescale is used for some kind of public time service. It's a serious problem. There are many such private timescales. I'm sure you know who they are. Typically, they don't agree with UTC. They don't agree with each other. That means that the data from different timescales can't be combined or compared, and users often don't know the definition of the private timescale. Finally, a private timescale is not appropriate for users who need a link to UTC for legal or regulatory purposes. And we have a lot of customers like that, mostly commercial and financial institutions who are required by statute to link to national standard of UTC. So that's the end of the sermon. Now let me turn to how UTC is computed. The International Bureau of Weights and Measures computes it, and they receive data from a whole bunch of laboratories. There are about 500 clocks that are used. From the data from about 500 clocks are used, and the result is called International Atomic Time (TAI). Now TAI is a paper time scale. It has no physical clock, and it's not transmitted by anybody. That is, it's a purely paper time scale which exists in the BIPM and among the standards laboratories, but it's not transmitted. It's not the basis for any time signal or time service that's distributed by any official service. Now, the leap second adjustments are added, as I mentioned before, and the result of adding leap seconds to TAI is where UTC is. So UTC has the characteristics and the stability of TAI, except for the periodic addition of the leap seconds. The computation of all of this thing emphasizes long-term stability because that's a very important criterion that the frequency, the international standard of frequency, is as stable and as unchanging as we know how to make it. For information, just as a reference, the international atomic time is the frequency is known to something like a few parts to 10 to the minus 16. Now, unfortunately, the computation is done retrospectively, which means that UTC for any month is published by the 10th day of the following month. For example, we do not yet have the data for July. We won't have the data for July probably until next week sometime. So UTC does not exist in real time, which means that we don't know where UTC really is. We can figure out where UTC might be or where UTC will be, and that requires some kind of extrapolation. Now, of course, UTC is a paper time scale. There's no physical clock which realizes UTC, just as there's no physical clock which realizes TAI. Now, the time scales that you're usually familiar with are UTC laboratory, which is the implementation or the prediction of UTC implemented in some laboratory. And most countries have a timing laboratory which has a prediction of UTC, and they are called, for example, UTC NIST, which is our version, UTC USNO, which is the Naval Observatory's version, and so on. Each one of these timescales is operated by the laboratory and has a local ensemble of clocks, and they use some method for computing the ensemble average, and they then use that to predict where UTC is going to be. The BIPM publishes Circular T, which lists UTC minus UTC lab for every participating laboratory, and that's a piece of paper, or well, now it's an email. It used to be a piece of paper. They publish a provisional data every Wednesday, and in fact, I just got it about a few minutes before the talk, which is a provisional version of what UTC is going to be. But of course, I don't know what UTC is going to be for another 6 weeks or so. Now, laboratories like NIST steer UTC laboratory to UTC, and of course, the steering involves an extrapolation because if I have to produce UTC laboratory today, but I don't know where UTC is, so I have a method of prediction and extrapolation and so on and so on. And we could talk about that. It's not so important for this discussion. The steering methods, that is the frequency adjustments that we use, are published. NIST has a bulletin that lists all of that stuff. Typically, UTC NIST is within a few nanoseconds of UTC. And that's true of UTC USNO as well. The differences are typically 1 or 2 or 3 nanoseconds, and they vary slowly through the month. Okay, UTC NIST is the reference time scale for all of the services, for everything we do, all of our international services, and so on. Now, let me turn to the primary subject. Given that I've given you the background information, let me turn to the primary subject, which is what I really wanted to talk about this time, which is how you transmit time to a user, and that's in some ways the heart of the talk. In the first place, in general, the transmission accuracy and the stability are degraded relative to the reference time. And that's because the channels that are used, the channels that are available, they have a latency which fluctuates. They have a delay which fluctuates. There are often instabilities in the remote device. There is noise in the measurement process. And the bottom line is that the reference time signal is much more accurate and stable than these effects. To say it a different way, in general, we know the time internally much better than we can tell it to you, because, or when you being any user, because the signal that we transmit to you is degraded by the channel. And channel is a generic term. I don't mean to specifically mention any particular method, but all channels have these problems. The transmissions are less than ideal. And so very often when you discuss the characteristics of a reference clock, you assume that that is the characteristics of a process, of a time transfer process. You assume that the reference clock is a perfect device. And the reason for that is that in most situations, the reference clock is dramatically better than what the user sees. And so assuming that the reference clock is perfect and that all the problems are in the channel is pretty much a very good assumption for a real world kind of data system. Now, uh, let me give you a reason why it is useful to consider digital networks uh, as opposed to other sorts of data transmission systems. Uh, the characteristic, the traditional method of transferring time, in which most people, or many people use, is to use the signals from uh, global navigation satellites like GPS, and that is a very widespread, very common method, uh, and it's been used. It's increasingly used, and of course, the reason it's used is that it's there, and it's very well supported, very well maintained, very accurate, and so on and so on. Uh, in the recent years, and especially in the last 5 years, uh, there has been an increase in intentional and accidental jamming. Uh, and that's very common in military applications. It's quite common for military theaters to be GPS jammed. Uh, the bad guys, quote unquote, try to jam the system so that the good guys, quote unquote, can't use GPS, uh, and that's uh, an ongoing problem. But there's also an increasing number of civilian jamming and spoofing, uh, where jamming means basically overpowering the receiver by transmitting a signal that overpowers the receiver, and spoofing means transmitting a signal which looks like a proper signal, but is in fact has been doctored up to lead the receiver astray. That can happen in time or in frequency, in both. Uh, and so there are methods for synthesizing GPS signals which look like GPS signals, but which in fact are not. And it can be it is often difficult. It is often easy to tell that you've been jammed because the receiver simply stops working, uh, and you may not be able to know how to fix it, but you know you're being jammed. But spoofing is a more subtle effect because the receiver appears to be working properly, but in fact, the data that you're getting are completely spurious because they're not generated from the real satellites. They're generated by the bad guys. Uh, now, uh, there's a possible interference with any broadcast method. There are a number of other broadcast methods uh, that have been proposed, and I'm not going to discuss all of them. There are low Earth satellite methods, and so on and so on. All of them have possible interference. Uh, the interference is easier or harder depending on the details of the method, but any broadcast method can be jammed. It's simply a matter of how determined the adversary is. Uh, you know, Especially local area jamming, uh, which is much easier than wide area jamming. For example, the approach control at Newark Airport is routinely jammed by truckers who drive on the New Jersey Turnpike, and they don't want their uh, boss to know where the truck is. So the truck has a GPS receiver, which they jam. And of course, the jamming is not confined to the truck. It jams the approach control at Newark Airport. And the Jersey Turnpike runs right next to the runway. So it's a significant problem. So it's not in any sense limited to people who are intentional bad guys. You might call these truck drivers accidental bad guys. They're not really trying to screw up Newark Airport. They just don't want the boss to know where the truck is. Now, in recognizing this fact, there's an executive order which was published in 2020, which ordered NIST to provide a traceable link to UTC that was independent of signals from the navigation system. Now, the systems that we've used are fiber-based or network-based systems rather than broadcast-based systems. And the concept of traceable is an important point because in the metrology community, traceable means that the link has been calibrated with an accuracy and an uncertainty, so that I can tell you uh, that the signal that you receive has a characteristics, an accuracy, and a statistics that have been measured or determined in some way, and and that's often a hard job, because it's often a hard job to characterize what you might call the endpoint, the last little bit of how the signal is received or how the signal is used, and that can be quite a difficult business. Uh, Now, it's important in executive order to maintain a link to international standards, simply because interoperability is an important aspect. NIST is not the only system that provides time, and combining time from multiple sources is an important issue. Uh, it's important that a user not know where the time signal is coming from, so that the details of the source are not important. And that's particularly important for legal or regulatory requirements, uh, especially in Europe, which requires traceability to a national standards laboratory. And of course, there are several national standards laboratories in Europe, uh, because there are several countries, a whole bunch of countries in Europe, and each one has its own standards laboratory. And it's important that all of them agree, so that uh, it's somewhat less important in the United States, although uh, Canada uh, and Mexico both maintain standards laboratories, and it's important that we collaborate. Now, there's a subtle issue here that I want to mention, and that's the cost model. The previous PNT services, all the ones that you know about, uh, Loran or GPS or WWV, whatever, all of these services were provided as free to the user. Of course, they're not free services; they're paid for by somebody. But from the user's perspective, they were free, and that was an incentive to use them. On the other hand, all the enhancements that we've talked about, or that have been proposed or been discussed, are fee for service, so that if you want to use something that gets around the problem of GPS jamming or spoofing or whatever, uh, you're going to have to pay for that. And that's a change from the previous style in which the service was provided as a public good, paid for off the top by the government somehow. Uh, as a result of that, of course, there are multiple third-party providers. When there is a business to be made and there is profit to be made, there are a whole bunch of companies, each one of which has some sort of solution which attempts to mitigate the problems of jamming and spoofing in some way or other. And of course, I'm not going to discuss all the various possibilities, but there are a whole bunch of different possibilities. The important point is that these services are not licensed, they're not approved, they're not monitored, they're not calibrated. And so that is, I'm not trying to suggest that there's anything wrong with these services. On the other hand, I'm not suggesting there's anything to be guaranteed to be right with them either. They are, but they are what they are. We don't, they don't have to ask uh, any kind of standards committee for approval, and they don't ask any standards committee for approval. So that in general, we don't know how well a particular service actually works. Uh, there may be some exceptions where we have tested the service, but that's a very rare business. We test very little services. Now, excuse me. Let me describe the NIST service that we offering. Uh, what we do is we provide an access to the timescale UTC NIST, uh, and we provide an access at Boulder or at Gaithersburg, uh, or we can also provide an access from radio station WWV, but that's somewhat more difficult to do because WWV is kind of out in the middle of nowhere relatively, so that a fiber connection or circuit connection to WWV is possible, but it's a little more difficult because uh, a radio station needs a lot of space, it has big antennas, and so it's located far away from everything. It's sort of out in the middle of a field. Now, there are a number of different details in the connections, and I'm going to discuss some of the various possibilities. Uh, but basically, the service that we offer does not define the connection. Uh, if person X or company X comes to us and says we'd like to connect to the service, well, we discussed, well, what do you really want, and so on and so on. And here are the various. Here's a menu of possibilities, and the user the user would decide, well, this is what I need or this is what I want, and this is and so on. Now we help you do this. We provide support for maintaining and running the system and so on and so on. On the other hand, it's not a free service. This is not a it's not a publicly available service. This is a dedicated service between NIST and some customer, so that the customer would be asked to pay for it. And so this is in line with my previous slide, that the enhancement is not paid for off the top. NIST contributes its signals and its data and its know-how and its advice and so on and so on. But the largest recurring cost is almost always the cost of the circuit, and that's something that the user has to provide. So the non-recurring costs are usually much smaller, and in the end, it's the recurring cost that eats your lunch because it goes on forever. Now we share operational and maintenance activities. We have a few customers, and in each case, we have a discussion, an agreement about exactly who's going to do what and how we're going to do it, and so on and so on. Okay, so that we don't make any profit, and this is not in the profit. This is a government agency. We don't make any profit, so we provide it at cost. We charge you whatever it costs us. Now, so this is a picture of what the configuration might look like. There's UTC NIST in the green box, and it's linked to the timing laboratories and the BIPM and so on and so on. And then there's a channel which is connected to the user equipment. And now there are a number of different possibilities. For example, I show you here a number of different kinds of channels. There's a dark fiber channel, which is a dedicated fiber which runs from us to you. Or there is a fiber which is shared, and you guys, the user gets a unique wavelength, but the physical fiber is shared with other users. Finally, there's optical transport network, which is a shared community system in which you don't get a unique wavelength. You get a service. You put the bytes in at one end and they come out at the other end. Finally, you could have a satellite link, which we also use, but it's very expensive, and it's used between timing laboratories, but it's not used much else because the ground station stuff is expensive. Now, at the receiving equipment, well, there's all sorts of receivers. There's a simple receiver. You could have just a thing that receives the signal and distributed the pulses, or you could have a rubidium local oscillator, or you could have a cesium local oscillator, or you could have a clock ensemble. And so you can to decide the system, you have to choose one from column A and one from column B, and that's the next step, is how you choose one from column A and one from column B. And so in order to do that, you have to first of all understand that all of these methods use the same basic system. It's called the two-way method, in which you estimate the one-way delay of a channel by measuring the round-trip delay and dividing by 2. So you, the user, the client system measures the round-trip delay. It sends a request to the server, see how long it takes to come back. Measure that round-trip delay, divides by 2. That's the one-way delay. The magnitude of the total delay is not important, because you're going to measure the total round-trip delay and divide by 2. The accuracy depends on the fact that you measure the round-trip delay, you divide by 2, and that gives you the one-way delay. And that means that the inbound and outbound delays have to be equal. And the method depends on the fact that the inbound and outbound delays are equal. To the extent that they're not equal, you're going to get the wrong answer. You're going to measure the round-trip delay, but it's not going to be, the one-way delay is not 1/2 of that value. Now, the stability of the method, of course, is limited by the fluctuations in the symmetry of the delay. That is, you send a packet and and it comes back at a slightly different time from when you sent it, which means that the characteristics of the delay have changed in that little bit of time, or from packet to packet they may change. And so the statistics are very important, and the characteristics of the network, the stability of the network is a very important thing. Now, in general, a dedicated circuit has a higher degree of symmetry and it's very stable. And what that means is that if you use the two-way method on a dedicated circuit, you're going to get a better performance, simply because you're measuring the delay, and the round-trip delay and the one-way delay are much more tightly coupled together. You're going to get a much better answer on what the one-way delay really is. So that's the fundamental advantage of a dedicated circuit. On the other hand, the symmetry and the stability in a packet switch network are often much poorer. So for example, if you use plain old NTP on the public network, then you're limited by the jigglies and wigglies of the delay of the public network and the fact that you're competing with all the folks who are watching movies or doing whatever it is they're doing, and that causes jitter in the delay, which of course affects the accuracy of the time service. So now there are questions. There are questions you have to ask yourself. What type of channel should I use? Okay, and the message format turns out is really less important. Okay, that is, every channel, you're limited by the characteristics of the channel, most importantly, and less importantly, by just how you organize the bits in the message. Okay, do I need the accuracy of a dedicated circuit? Well, that's a question. Okay, and finally, how often should I query the remote source? Now, that's an important question that I'm going to discuss in somewhat more detail a little bit later on, but it's not a trivial question. Finally, there's a question that I'm not going to discuss, which is when I receive the data, when I've measured the time difference between my clock and the system reference clock, what should I do with that data? Well, that's an extremely complicated, difficult question of how you adjust your local clock to match the data that you received, and that's a subject all by itself. And so I'd be glad to talk about it or refer you to literature or whatever, but it's a very complicated question. And so I grayed it out because I'm not going to talk about it. Okay. And now, finally, how should I characterize the performance of the process? What am I really interested in? Am I really interested in the RMS error, or am I really interested in the maximum error? Do I want to have some statistical measure of the accuracy or the stability or whatever? And so you need to decide, in other words, how you measure success, or unfortunately, how you measure failure. That is, what is it that you need, and how do you measure that you're getting it or that you're not getting it? Now, there's a system design trade space, and the idea is that the characteristics of the channel and the endpoint hardware should complement each other. Namely, that you design them together based on the requirements. And the idea is, in a well-designed system, the combination of the channel and the endpoint hardware are better than either device by itself. And what that usually means is that in the short term, that is from second to second, the endpoint clock is more stable than the remote reference seen through the channel. And the reason for that is that most channels have high frequency noise. Well, high frequency means second to second, or maybe even millisecond to millisecond. And that means that leaving your local clock alone is much better than trying to steer it, because when you steer it rapidly, you add noise, channel noise into it, which in fact degrades the clock. The clock would have been better off left alone. And I'm going to kind of give you an idea for how you make that argument quantitative, but that's an important aspect of all this business. Okay. Finally, in long term, the remote reference is better because the remote reference is a national timing laboratory. We do a lot of work to keep our frequency stable and our time accurate. And in the long term, the fluctuations in the channel are bounded and finite. And if you average for long enough, you're going to do better by steering to the long term. So that suggests a kind of a general strategy in which, in the short term, you depend on your own system, and in the long term, you depend on the remote system. And the crossover depends on the characteristics of the channel. And now you can see the way the trade space is, that the better you make your local clock, the poorer channel you can live with. Conversely, the better you make the channel, the poorer the clock can be, because you don't have to correct for the weaknesses of the channel. Okay. Finally, you may have to validate long-term accuracy if that's important. So, for example, national laboratories, NIST is calibrated every 2 years. We get a visitation or visiting from the BIPM, and our time service is calibrated with respect to the BIPM. And in general, almost every service, unless you really don't care about accuracy at all, but almost every calibration will be needed in the long term. We need some kind of recalibration, maybe every year, maybe every 2 years. NIST, the BIPM tries to calibrate national timing laboratories every 2 years, but often it slips. We don't get calibrated until 3 or 3.5 years. Now, let me give you some feeling for possible solutions, just so you kind of get an idea of what this is. First of all, if you want the lowest recurring cost, what you want is the cheapest possible circuit that's a little bit better than NTP on the public network. Then you choose an optical transport network, an OTN. Now, an OTN is noisy. It's not a quiet circuit, which means that because the circuit is noisy, you need a reasonably good clock at the other end, so that you would use a rubidium or a cesium clock at the other end. And the answer is that compensates for time steps in the circuit delay, because on an OTN network, there will be time steps in the circuit delay. The circuit delay will have a discontinuous time step, and that time step is something which you can see if your local clock is stable enough, because your local clock doesn't do those kind of things. And so that's the argument of this trade space argument that I'm making, is that the local clock is good enough in short term that you can detect the change in the channel and say, aha, the channel has changed its characteristics. And that's because your local clock is very stable. Uh, on the other hand, there is a certain amount of noise, which means that you need some kind of sophisticated analysis at the user end to compensate for the jiggly wigglies in the channel. And there are a number of different methods. There's a thing called the lucky packet method. There's a thing called the huff and puff filter. And I'm not going to discuss statistics. The point is, though, that you often have to combine uh, a low-cost network with a fancier clock at the endpoint and a lot of post-processing of analyzing of the data. And we do that kind of stuff routinely. We do that with NTP routinely. And there's a lot of stuff published in literature about it. And you just have to be aware that the price, or so to speak, the advantage of getting a low-cost network has to be offset by the fact that you're going to have to do more work at the end. On the other hand, if you don't want to do anything, you want to get the simplest possible network, then you use a dark fiber. You use a dark fiber, dedicated dark fiber, you use White Rabbit, and you don't have to do anything, because the White Rabbit format combined with the dark fiber will give you nanosecond level accuracy and stability at the other end, almost without doing anything else. On the other hand, the dark fiber is the most expensive possible network solution you can buy. And so the price may be, I don't know what it is, maybe a factor or two higher. And so now you have this trade space. What is it that you're willing to do, and what is it that you're willing to pay for? Finally, you can decide that you want some residual GNSS dependence. That is, you're going to use this system, but you're going to have a GPS receiver as an alternative, or as a backup, or as a running spare, or as a calibrator or something. And that can mitigate some of the disadvantages of the fiber circuit, because when the fiber circuit takes a time step, you can see that in the GPS receiver. On the other hand, when the GPS receiver fails, you can use the fiber circuit to continue operation, even though GPS has been jammed or spoofed. And in fact, you can detect jamming and spoofing when the fiber circuit appears to be transmitting data correctly, and your GPS data appears to be walking off in some random direction, and you say, "Aha, maybe I'm being spoofed." And so that the two systems, again, the concept is that the two systems can be better than either system by itself. Now, let me show you some data just to show you what can be done. This is two independent White Rabbit circuits from Gaithersburg, Maryland to McLean, Virginia. And what we did was we measured the time difference between the two clocks that were driving the two independent White Rabbit circuits at the Gaithersburg end and at the McLean end. And I show you the two data sets. That is, the blue is the McLean end time difference, and the green is the Gaithersburg time difference. And you see that they really track very nicely. So that this is an example that White Rabbit can do. It kind of shows you what the capabilities of White Rabbit is. It's accurate and stable at the nanosecond, or maybe even at the sub-nanosecond level. On the other hand, here is an OTN network. This is between McLean and Atlanta. It's about I don't know, about 400 miles one way, and you can see two things. First of all, the time data are offset by almost five microseconds, and that's because the delay is asymmetric. That is, the path from McLean to Atlanta is not the same as the path from Atlanta to McLean, and so when you use the two-way method, you get an error because the inbound and outbound delays are not the same. When you divide by two, you get the wrong answer. Also, you see that there are the data are characterized by these occasional spikes, which are really quite large. they're larger than 100 nanoseconds, followed by much quieter periods, so that the data are not stationary in the sense that they can't be characterized by a simple statistical process. On the other hand, you could use some sophisticated statistical analysis to figure out what was going on. You could recognize that the spikes really were spikes, and you could ignore them, and so on and so on. So this is an example where sophisticated analysis can be used to compensate for some of the noise on the channel, but it cannot be used to compensate for the fact that the channel is offset. That is, there is a static offset of almost 5 microseconds, and you'd have to know that by doing some sort of calibration or by some sort of comparison or by some sort of independent method, because the channel has a stable network offset of almost 5 microseconds. And that's what you got when you save the money to buy an OTN channel. So I'm trying to give you a feeling for what the possible differences are between in the different methods. Now, this is an example of one method. Here's another. This is again an OTN link. This one is between Gaithersburg and the stock exchange in New Jersey. And again, it's the same. This is a slightly different idea. The time difference is measured at GPS. The time difference is measured with respect, that is, in New Jersey, there is a GPS receiver, and the blue is measuring the time difference of the local clock there against GPS time, and the green is measuring the time difference of the local clock with respect to the NIST time received over the OTN link. Now, there are two things to notice about. First of all, the NIST link has got the same asymmetric offset. That is, but here the symmetric offset is about 800 nanoseconds. So it's somewhat different. In other words, it's a characteristic of the channel, and it varies from one channel to the other. It has to be calibrated in some way or other. Second of all, you may notice that the green and the blue data appear to be slightly out of phase, and that's a truth. That's an artifact of how the data are measured. It's not a real effect. It's just a matter of how the data have been measured in New Jersey. But you can see that the data agree at the few nanosecond level, maybe say 5 or 10 nanoseconds, but there is an 800 nanosecond offset. So these data are somewhat better than the data I showed you before for McLean to Atlanta. The path is a little bit shorter, but again, you have these basically same problems, that there is a significant offset which has to be calibrated or measured or determined in some way. And noise at this is a quieter system. The noise is only about plus or minus 30 nanoseconds peak to peak. Now, let me turn to the question of, this is one more slide that I wanted to show you. Whoops. This is a public network, a public packet network, and here the differences are in the order of microseconds. This is between Gila in Boulder, Colorado, and NIST in Boulder and WWV. And this just illustrates the point that although NIST in Boulder is about across the street from Gila, or just a little bit more than across the street, and WWV is almost 60 miles away, the time differences are almost the same. So that the asymmetry of a network, of a path, does not always depend on the geometrical distance between the places, because in fact, the path from Gila to NIST, even though it's almost across the street from each other, in fact runs through downtown Denver, which is a round trip, a one-way path of almost 60 miles. So it's almost the same distance as the distance from Gila to Fort Collins, just by an accident. And you see the data are very similar. Also notice there's a time step, and that time step is of order, I don't know, 100 microseconds or something. And that comes from the fact that the network has changed its characteristics. It's sort of characteristic of what you're going to expect when you have those kind of OTN links. Now, let me turn to the question of how you actually would construct such a link. And this is sort of maybe a little more technical, but it illustrates the point that I wanted to make. So what I did was I started out with a cheap quartz crystal oscillator. And in fact, this is a cheap quartz crystal oscillator, which is mounted inside of a commercial time server, a commercial server. It's just a plain old commercial box. And what I did was I measured its stability against a local cesium reference timescale, and on the x-axis, I show the averaging time. That is the time I waited between measurements. So I waited, 10 to the 0 seconds, 1 second, 10 seconds, 100 seconds, and so on and so on and so on. And on the y-axis, I show the error. That is, what error? How did the error depend? And you can see that for up to about 10 seconds, the error is a little bit less than a microsecond, and then it slowly begins to grow as the frequency of the oscillator becomes slowly diverges from the truth, and you can see that the slope increases. For those of you who are knowledgeable about statistics, this statistic is called TDEV, but you don't really have to understand the statistics. You understand the concept. That what I'm looking at is how stable is the time of the oscillator as a function of how long I wait to measure it. Now, if I were to construct a time loop to synchronize that oscillator to the local reference, that is, instead of letting the test be free running, which I'm doing now and just measuring, if I actually controlled it, then I would get the upper curve is the same curve that I showed you on the previous slide, and the lower curve is how well I can stabilize the oscillator. And so now I'm stabilizing it essentially to a noiseless local system. That is, it's not completely noiseless, but it's a local CCM clock connected by a cable. So it's almost purely noiseless. And you can see that I've improved the characteristics for every averaging time. And the characteristics have now improved everywhere. And that's not surprising. I've got a local reference which is much, much quieter than anything else in the whole system. Now, let's suppose that I tried to do this not with a local system, but with a remote system located somewhere, in fact, in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And you can see that what I showed you here is one curve, which is labeled A, is the same old free running stability, and B is the time difference seen through the network. And you can see an example of what I showed you before. At short averaging times, less than about 1,000 seconds, and less than about 10 to the 3 seconds, the free running stability of the local clock is better than the free running stability of the remote clock seen through the network, even though the remote clock is in fact much, much better. The crossover occurs at about 1,000 seconds, and that is the way I would define and characterize my control loop. Namely, for times less than 1,000 seconds, I would use the local clock and leave it alone. For times longer than 1,000 seconds, I would use the local clock steered to the remote reference, and I would obtain a statistic which had the best characteristics of both characteristics. Namely, it was the characteristics of the local clock for times less than 1,000 seconds and the characteristics of the remote clock for times greater than 1,000 seconds. Now, suppose that I did something else. Suppose that instead of doing it using a remote reference far away in Gaithersburg, I did it using a much closer reference, one that's in NIST just down the street. Well, that's a closer reference, and now what I see is the curve marked C. And the other two curves are the same as I had before. A is the free running stability, B is the stability of the difference that's far away, and C is the stability that's closer in. And you can see that the stability of closer in is quieter. And what that means is that the crossover is now quieter. It's now at a few hundred seconds, and the deviation at a few hundred seconds is less. And what that means is if I used this kind of network, I could achieve a better stability and the crossover would be a few hundred seconds. And again, it would have the characteristics of the local clock at short term and the characteristics of the remote clock at long term. And I would design the characteristics after I had acquired all these data. So let me have some conclusions. First of all, the accuracy and the statistical characteristics of a user application really define the type of channel that is needed between NIST and the user site. There is no such thing as one type of circuit fitting all requirements or whatever. Okay, a dedicated dark fiber circuit provides the best performance, but has the highest recurring cost. Typically, a dark fiber circuit can provide an accuracy at somewhat on the order of a nanosecond. An OTN link is much cheaper, but it requires hardware at the remote end and more sophisticated processing and measurements. Okay, the accuracy of the order of microseconds, but you got to work for your money here. You don't get nanosecond level accuracy for nothing. You got to do some analysis, some post processing, and the link will often have asymmetry. That is, you'll get an answer which may be stable but is biased. And that means you need some kind of additional calibrations and validations will probably be needed. Now, next of all, the overall design of the link should result in a combination of the network channel and remote hardware that has better performance than each component by itself. And I've tried to illustrate that point with some of the data, but that's a general principle. That's the goal of what you're trying to do, is that you're trying to use a network to improve what you already have. And the result should be better than either piece by itself. And generally speaking, at shorter averaging times, the local clock is usually more stable, and at long averaging times, the remote clock is more stable, so that this consideration determines the interval between measurement cycles. If you measure too rapidly, you're not being optimum because you're putting network noise into the local clock, and it would be better left alone. Okay, so OTN links provide a good trade-off, but the performance varies from link to link, and you have to understand what you're getting and you have to think about it. That's all. Thanks very much. I'd be glad to answer questions or discussion or whatever.
Thank you very much, Judah. So let's open the floor for questions.
I could stop sharing if I know how to stop sharing.
Sure. Let me see if I can make it for
Yeah,
you.
I don't know how to do this. Stop sharing.
Yeah,
I don't know.
exactly.
Maybe
Yeah,
I've stopped already.
no, click the share, that share button. You were there, and that should have stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'd be pleased to try to answer questions,
Sure.
or I could accept emails afterwards, whichever you like.
Sure. I mean, let's see if there is any questions here. Great. So I have a question, Judah. Like, let's say with the presence of, let's say, higher precision in like these like GNSS receivers, would it be like would we expect to see something more, let's say, newer, like where you have something that references this, like let's say, multi-constellation receivers to monitor, let's say, these different time scales. Let's say, for example, the atomic clock that you have in NIST, one in ICT, one, let's say, in NPL, and so on, like BIMP, and then, like, I don't know, and then you have, let's say, once per second some measurements that they get collected somewhere, and then you can actually stream those changes, or you can look at the differences. Can we expect something like this, or something like
Oh,
this already
sure,
exists?
sure, sure. I mean uh, that yes, of course you could do that. And uh, you can. We don't we don't publish our data in real time, but we could publish our data in real time. And
Mhm.
and uh, the only the only restriction about that, or requirement about that, is that the timing laboratories have a format of the data, and if you wanted to do that, you would have to use the timing format that we use. There are two basic timing formats. Uh, the common one is Rhinex, which you may know about, uh, and the difficulty with Rhinex is that it usually requires post processing. That is,
Yes.
you can't just take the data and look at it. We have a simpler format called CGT-TTS, which actually doesn't require any post processing. You actually get the time difference of laboratory minus GPS time, and yeah, you could certainly do that. In fact, that's what the BIPM does. That's how the BIPM looks at different laboratories. Many of the laboratories work exactly the way you just said. They 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 measure uh, mostly with respect to GPS. There is some use of Galileo, which is the European version of GPS, and there is some use of Beidou, which is the Chinese version of GPS. Um, GLONASS, which is the Russian version of GPS, has some technical issues, and it's not very widely used. But it could be. But GLONASS has some difficult. We could discuss the GLONASS issues, but most people use some combination of GPS, Galileo, and Beidou.
Yeah. Yeah. So 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 as far as you're saying, like there is no let's say, accessible to public service today that you can like look for this. So there is room for making something like this, let's say, with a consortium, like let's say like what OCP can provide, or
Oh, well, no, there is. I think there is a question of do you want real time or not real time?
no, real time,
The
real,
real time is hard. Uh,
yes,
the not real time is easy. Not real
yes,
time is easy to do. There is the International Geophysical Service (IGS), and they publish orbits and clocks, and you could get that data. The BIPM publishes the offset between GPS time and you can get all that data. Uh, but that stuff is generally not available in real time. Uh,
yeah,
I think if you wanted real time, uh, you have to decide what you really mean by real time. Are you talking about second to second or minute to minute or 10
yeah,
minute delay or whatever? Uh, I think you'd have to. Uh, I think that's an offline discussion. I mean,
yeah,
if you want that data, then you have to talk to us, and we could probably give it to you.
for sure.
But we don't publish it normally. It's the second to second data is normally not published directly.
Yeah. Anyone else you want to add something?
Yeah, I just roll here. I just want to say that the IGS also offers a real-time service as well, and various metrology institutes subscribe to that one as well and stream data there, and it's free to pick up for everybody. And I believe NIST could do that as well, and might do that in the future, anyways.
I think that's absolutely true. Uh, you have to be a little bit careful about using IGS data, uh, and part of the problem is that IGS maintains an internal timescale, which is the IGS timescale, which is not necessarily the timescale of any laboratory. So that uh, you would normally use IGS data to compute the difference between two timing laboratories or between your laboratory and something else. If you had a receiver that contributed to the IGS, then you could get IGS data directly as a difference between your receiver and the laboratory receiver. It's not a difficult job, but it's not totally trivial either.
Wonderful. Any more questions? Again, if none, we'll thank again Judah for today's presentation, and we'll see everyone in 2 weeks by a presentation by Thomas Bern from Mainberg, and wish you like a great rest of the day, week, night, depending on where you are on the planet.
Okay, thank
Great.
you very much. It's been a pleasure giving you a talk. I just reiterate that if anybody has any questions afterwards, they can just send me an email.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Judah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.